In my decades working in prisons and public hospitals, I've witnessed something that would horrify well-meaning progressives. Their policies of compassion systematically create the very suffering they claim to prevent. The welfare state, designed to eliminate poverty and despair, has instead institutionalized both. I've watched generation after generation of patients trapped in cycles of dependency, their dignity eroded by systems supposedly designed to help them. The cruel irony is that those who implement these policies live comfortably insulated from their consequences. Today, I'll show you how government compassion becomes systematic cruelty, why good intentions guarantee bad outcomes, and how genuine charity differs fundamentally from bureaucratic sentimentalism. The evidence lies not in abstract theories, but in the broken lives I've encountered daily for 30 years. What passes for kindness has become the most sophisticated form of oppression ever devised. The time has come to examine this uncomfortable truth with the clinical precision it demands. Chapter 1: The Welfare State as Laboratory of Human Degradation. Working in Britain's most deprived areas, I discovered that the welfare state functions as a vast experiment in human degradation. My patients taught me that when government assumes responsibility for every aspect of human welfare, it systematically destroys the very qualities that make life worth living: purpose, dignity, and personal agency. I've examined countless young men who've never worked, never needed to work, and consequently never developed the psychological satisfactions that come from productive effort. Their lives follow a predictable pattern. They wake without purpose, spend days in aimless activity, and seek meaning through temporary pleasures that provide no lasting satisfaction. The women fare little better, often bearing children to multiple fathers, knowing the state will provide for their offspring while offering no expectation of personal responsibility. These aren't moral judgments but clinical observations based on thousands of case histories. When human beings are relieved of the necessity to provide for themselves and their families, they don't become liberated, they become infantilized. The welfare state creates what I can only describe as a permanent psychological adolescence, where individuals reach physical maturity while remaining emotionally and morally stunted. I've observed this phenomenon across multiple generations within the same families. Grandmothers who've never worked past this expectation to daughters who pass it to granddaughters, creating dynasties of dependency. The psychological damage compounds over time. Each generation becomes more detached from the concept of productive work as a source of meaning and identity. Government compassion, by removing the natural consequences of choices, removes the very mechanism by which humans learn wisdom. The result is generations of people who remain children in adult bodies, dependent not just financially but psychologically on systems that claim to serve them while actually enslaving them. What's most tragic is watching the slow death of aspiration in these communities. When effort becomes optional, excellence becomes impossible. The welfare state doesn't merely provide material support, it provides an entire worldview that absolves individuals of responsibility for their circumstances while simultaneously ensuring they remain trapped within those circumstances. Chapter 2: How Cultural Messages Reinforce Dependency. The degradation isn't merely economic, it's profoundly cultural. During my years treating patients from the underclass, I observed how our society bombards them with messages that simultaneously excuse their failures and promise easy solutions. The culture tells them they're victims of circumstances beyond their control while selling them fantasies of instant success through lottery tickets, celebrity worship, and get-rich-quick schemes. This creates a peculiar psychological state. They feel entitled to success without effort while believing they're powerless to achieve it through their own actions. I've noticed how popular culture, supposedly created for mass consumption, actually serves the interests of those who benefit from widespread dependency. When young people's aspirations are shaped by rap music celebrating immediate gratification, designer clothing, and criminal behavior, they're being conditioned for failure. The entertainment industry profits from keeping the masses in a state of perpetual dissatisfaction, always consuming but never producing anything of value. Educational institutions reinforce this conditioning by abandoning standards, promoting self-esteem over achievement, and teaching that all lifestyles are equally valid. My patients often quoted these cultural messages verbatim, explaining their choices through language they'd absorbed from television, music, and social media. They spoke of their rights without corresponding understanding of responsibilities, their needs without recognition of the difference between wants and necessities. The cruelest aspect is how this cultural programming masquerades as liberation while actually ensuring continued subjugation. Those who promote these messages live entirely different lives, sending their own children to private schools with strict standards while advocating permissiveness for others. They consume high culture while producing low culture for mass consumption, maintaining their privileged position by ensuring others remain trapped in cycles of immediate gratification and poor decision-making. The cultural elite has created a sophisticated system of social control disguised as freedom. By encouraging destructive behaviors among the poor while maintaining traditional values in their own lives, they ensure a permanent underclass dependent on government assistance and professional intervention. Chapter 3: The Psychology of Learned Helplessness in Welfare Recipients. Through countless interviews with benefit recipients, I've documented how government assistance creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, but on a massive scale. When the state provides unconditional support regardless of behavior, recipients quickly learn that their actions have no meaningful consequences. This isn't stupidity, it's rational adaptation to an irrational system. I've watched intelligent individuals become incapable of making simple decisions because they've learned that others will always intervene to prevent serious consequences. The psychological damage manifests in several predictable ways. First, an inability to plan beyond immediate gratification. Second, a profound sense of powerlessness despite material provision. And third, a resentment toward the very system they depend upon. This resentment puzzled me initially until I realized its source. Being treated as incapable of self-care is inherently humiliating. My patients often expressed anger toward social workers, housing officials, and benefit administrators, but this anger was misdirected frustration at their own powerlessness. The system strips them of agency while demanding gratitude for their servitude. More perniciously, it teaches them to view their dependency as a right rather than a temporary necessity. I've encountered middle-aged men who've never held jobs, not because work was unavailable, but because they'd learned that effort was unnecessary. When challenged to explain their choices, they invariably blame external circumstances, the economy, discrimination, lack of opportunities. These explanations aren't entirely false, but they obscure the crucial truth that personal agency remains possible even under difficult circumstances. What's particularly disturbing is how the welfare system creates its own psychological vocabulary to justify dependency. Recipients learn to speak of their conditions, their situations, and their circumstances as though these were permanent features of reality rather than temporary challenges requiring action. They develop elaborate narratives explaining why normal expectations don't apply to them, why ordinary rules shouldn't govern their behavior, and why society owes them indefinite support. This learned helplessness extends beyond material dependency into moral and emotional spheres. When consequences are removed from choices, the capacity for moral reasoning atrophies. I've treated individuals who genuinely couldn't understand why their behavior caused problems because they'd never experienced meaningful negative feedback for destructive actions. Chapter 4: How Elite Sentimentalism Perpetuates Suffering. The most disturbing aspect of this systematic destruction is how it's perpetuated by people who genuinely believe they're helping. I've attended countless conferences where social workers, government officials, and academic experts discussed evidence-based interventions while remaining completely isolated from the consequences of their recommendations. These professional helpers live in leafy suburbs, send their children to selective schools, and maintain strict personal standards while advocating permissiveness for their clients. Their sentimentalism isn't malicious, it's worse, it's sincere. They've convinced themselves that expecting responsibility from the poor is cruel, that maintaining standards is discriminatory, and that any criticism of destructive behavior constitutes victim blaming. This creates a bizarre moral universe where those who enable destructive behavior claim moral superiority over those who would prevent it. I've watched social workers celebrate keeping families together despite overwhelming evidence of child abuse, their priority being their own feelings of compassion rather than child welfare. The professional helping class has created elaborate theoretical frameworks to justify their approach: trauma-informed care, cultural sensitivity, harm reduction. Each framework serves the same function, removing moral judgment from situations that desperately require it. When a young mother neglects her children to pursue drug addiction, the system responds not with appropriate consequences but with additional services, perpetuating the cycle while claiming moral virtue. The helpers feel good about their compassion while the children suffer the consequences of misguided kindness. This creates a perverse incentive structure where professional helpers benefit from the continuation of problems they're supposedly solving. The sentimentalist approach treats poor people as incapable of moral agency, which is itself a form of discrimination more pernicious than old-fashioned prejudice. At least traditional prejudice acknowledged that its targets were fully human, capable of both good and evil. Modern sentimentalism treats the poor as moral children, incapable of genuine choice and therefore exempt from genuine responsibility. This elite sentimentalism serves important psychological functions for its practitioners. It allows them to feel morally superior without making personal sacrifices, to claim compassion without accepting inconvenience, and to maintain their privileged position while appearing to help those less fortunate. Chapter 5: The Language of Bureaucratic Deception. Working within government healthcare, I've observed how language becomes a tool for obscuring rather than revealing truth. The helping professions have developed an elaborate vocabulary designed to avoid acknowledging personal responsibility or moral failure. Criminals become justice-involved individuals, drug addicts become people with substance use disorders, and irresponsible parents become families experiencing challenges. This linguistic manipulation isn't accidental, it serves specific political purposes. By removing moral language from social problems, professionals can avoid addressing moral solutions. When teenagers repeatedly commit crimes, they're described as at-risk youth rather than as young criminals who need consequences for their actions. This language shapes thinking in predictable ways. If social problems result from external circumstances rather than personal choices, then solutions must involve changing circumstances rather than changing behavior. I've attended case conferences where teams of professionals discussed intervention strategies and support packages for individuals whose problems stemmed from simple refusal to follow basic social norms. The elaborate terminology creates an illusion of expertise while masking the absence of effective solutions. More insidiously, this language prevents honest diagnosis of problems. When we can't accurately describe reality, we can't effectively address it. The corruption of language serves those who benefit from prolonged social problems, the vast bureaucracy of professional helpers whose jobs depend on maintaining rather than solving the issues they're supposedly addressing. If problems were actually solved, entire professional classes would become redundant. Therefore, there's a perverse incentive to develop approaches that manage rather than eliminate social pathologies. This linguistic deception has profound psychological effects on both helpers and clients. Helpers begin to believe their own euphemisms, losing touch with the reality of the situations they're attempting to address. Clients learn to speak in therapeutic jargon, describing their destructive choices in clinical terminology that absolves them of moral responsibility. The ultimate result is a complete disconnection between language and reality, where serious social problems are discussed in terms so abstract and euphemistic that meaningful intervention becomes impossible. We end up with elaborate systems of professional communication that successfully obscure the very problems they claim to address. Chapter 6: Why Moral Relativism Becomes Practical Tyranny. Perhaps the most destructive aspect of government compassion is its foundation in moral relativism. During my psychiatric practice, I've observed how the absence of clear moral standards devastates psychological functioning. Humans require moral structure to maintain mental health. When society refuses to provide this structure, individuals suffer predictable psychological consequences. The relativist position, that all moral choices are equally valid, sounds tolerant and sophisticated, but it creates profound anxiety in those who must actually live with the consequences of their decisions. I've treated numerous patients whose psychological distress stemmed directly from moral confusion. When society tells them that all lifestyle choices are equally valid while their own choices produce misery, they experience cognitive dissonance that manifests as depression, anxiety, and rage. The relativist approach serves the interests of those who can afford to experiment with alternative lifestyles because they possess the cultural capital to recover from mistakes. For those without such resources, moral relativism becomes a trap. When young women are told that single motherhood is just another valid choice, they're not informed that this choice dramatically increases their risk of poverty and their children's risk of educational failure and criminal involvement. The refusal to make moral distinctions masquerades as tolerance while actually constituting a form of intellectual tyranny. Those who point out the practical consequences of moral choices are accused of intolerance, discrimination, or prejudice. This shuts down necessary conversations about cause and effect, ensuring that destructive patterns continue unchallenged. What's particularly insidious is how moral relativism becomes selectively applied. While the poor are told that all choices are equally valid, the elite maintain strict standards in their own lives. They practice delayed gratification, invest in education, maintain stable relationships, and carefully manage their resources, all while preaching that such behaviors represent mere cultural preferences rather than practical necessities. This creates a two-tier moral system where different standards apply to different social classes. The privileged follow traditional virtues while preaching modern relativism, ensuring their continued advantage over those foolish enough to take relativist principles seriously. Moral relativism thus becomes a sophisticated form of social control, maintaining hierarchy while appearing to promote equality. Chapter 7: Practical Strategies for Restoration of Responsibility. Based on my clinical experience, genuine compassion requires restoring rather than removing personal responsibility. The individuals I've seen recover from dependency share certain characteristics. They've accepted accountability for their situations, developed future-oriented thinking, and committed to sustained effort rather than seeking instant solutions. These transformations rarely occur within government systems designed to eliminate consequences. Instead, they happen through religious organizations, private charities, and community groups that maintain clear expectations while providing genuine support. Effective intervention requires what I call compassionate accountability, holding people responsible for their choices while providing assistance in developing better decision-making capabilities. This approach acknowledges that humans have both the capacity for self-destruction and the potential for self-improvement. Private charity naturally incorporates this balance because donors have direct relationships with recipients and can observe the results of their assistance. When charity becomes bureaucratized and professionalized, it loses this essential quality of accountability. The restoration of responsibility requires several practical steps. First, time-limiting assistance to prevent indefinite dependency. Second, requiring productive activity in exchange for support. Third, maintaining clear standards of acceptable behavior. And fourth, allowing natural consequences to teach necessary lessons. These principles seem harsh to those who confuse enablement with kindness, but they're actually more compassionate because they preserve human dignity while addressing genuine needs. The goal isn't punishment but education, teaching individuals that their choices matter and that they possess the power to improve their circumstances through sustained effort and wise decisions. This requires abandoning the therapeutic approach that treats all problems as symptoms of underlying conditions requiring professional intervention. Instead, we must return to the understanding that most social problems result from poor choices that can be corrected through better choices. Successful rehabilitation also requires addressing the cultural messages that promote dependency and immediate gratification. This means challenging the entertainment industry's promotion of destructive values, reforming educational systems to restore standards and expectations, and creating alternative cultural narratives that celebrate responsibility and achievement rather than victimhood and entitlement. Most importantly, we must recognize that genuine compassion sometimes requires saying no, setting limits, and allowing people to experience the consequences of their actions. This isn't cruelty, it's respect for human dignity and potential. When we treat people as capable of moral agency, we honor their humanity in ways that paternalistic care never can. Conclusion. Government compassion fails because it violates fundamental truths about human nature, that dignity comes from responsibility, that consequences teach wisdom, and that genuine charity strengthens rather than weakens its recipients. The welfare state, despite good intentions, systematically destroys the very qualities it claims to protect. My decades of clinical observation prove that true compassion requires the courage to maintain standards, enforce consequences, and trust in human capacity for growth. The choice before us is clear: continue the comfortable lie that enablement equals kindness, or embrace the difficult truth that real love sometimes says no. The lives of countless individuals depend on our willingness to choose reality over sentimentalism, genuine charity over bureaucratic compassion, and human dignity over comfortable dependency. The evidence is overwhelming, the choice is ours.